Hi, Terry Bolt here with Chapter 10 of Tactical Writing with Impactful Story Techniques. This is about speeches and presentations. You might be thinking, well, speeches, they're oral. That doesn't mean they're not written. Good speeches, good presentations have a huge element of writing, and the Twwist tactical techniques will be applicable here. You can just wing it for some oral communications, but that's really only effective after you've had lots of practice. So writing is the way we're going to approach these. So we'll look at it from that point of view. Everybody's got a story worth telling, but very few people know how to tell it. And part of that, very few people know how to get it down on paper from Oprah. Part of what makes speeches and presentations good is figuring out how to tell that story, how to put it down in such a way that you will engage with the audience. So in our normal twist, right, we have all of these elements leading up to storytelling, but as we're going to see in speech writing, we're going to hit all of the standard items of twist because, after all, we're trying to have a persuasive, impactful story, and we're going to need all of those items. So speech writing is a distinct and nuanced form of communication, differing significantly from traditional text writing. It demands clarity, engagement, memorability. It's essential to captivating an audience and leaving a lasting impact. Unlike written text, speeches require immediate comprehension and retention. This guide explores the effective writing techniques using the Twist approach and some SMART goals. Now, what did you think about that? That is not how you give a talk. That is not how you write a speech. You do not want to wallow text in your speech writing. So I wanted to have the introduction, and I decided I'd use this as the one place, right? Throughout this semester, or throughout the course, there's a lot of times when my slides are not really indicative of what I would call good speech writing, maybe not even the best in terms of presentations. The class has been a lot of work and probably needs some revisions to address some of those issues. But speech writing, in my view, is still very different from presentations. We'll get a little bit into that. But one of the things you really don't want, and I've not had near as much during the semester, is this wall of text. I could probably use more examples and more graphics, but wall of text, just bad. Your audience is reading instead of listening, and so it doesn't work very well. So what really does make speech writing versus text writing so different? So the first obvious thing is that speech writing caters to a live audience, and that requires immediate comprehension and engagement. You can't leave it for them to think about, right? Text writing allows readers to process information at their own pace, revisit content. So you actually, even if you want to convey the same content, have to do it differently for speeches and for writing because your audience is going to be consuming it differently. Speeches demand a direct connection with the audience, often in real time. This, in my view, often means really engaging with the audience, not just through the words you say, but how you look at them, how you interact with them. And that's a part of what it means. They can't go back and re-listen. The sound of what you say, the tone, the pace, the inflection of the speaker's voice, these all play a significant role in conveying the message. If I can have a rhythmic, rhetorical devices with alliteration and repetition, I can enhance the memorability of impact. And we'll go through some examples as we go through this. But more so than writing, speeches demand a sound that works. And if you're going to have imagery, which is great in any writing, right? You're here going to have imagery without visuals. You can't rely on the written word. You can't have images in speeches. You can in presentations, right? But you have to get this verbal imagery in your storytelling to create mental pictures for the audience. So you have to, again, use this sort of descriptive, vivid language that paints a picture. This is something we've talked about before within the Twist approach. This is general, just good storytelling, but it becomes even more important in speeches. And so it's something you're going to want to come back. Another thing, which I'm actually not so good at, is the power of the pause and emphasis. Strategic pauses and emphasis on certain words can highlight key points. Unlike written text, you don't get that opportunity. The best you can do in written text is add a comma, and maybe the reader will stop and get the pause. When you're writing for a speech, writing for pauses is actually important. When I'm writing very important, shorter speeches and presentations, when I was pitching my businesses, I would actually, when I wrote out the speech, I would write the word pause in big letters and bold just to make sure, because I tend to just go very fast and skip over stuff. So, but those strategic pauses can be very important. They can help emphasize the speech's message and engaging the audience. If you've asked the audience a rhetorical question, you're going to want to pause. Why? so they can think about the question, understand what's going on. Lots of examples like that. So, and you have to adapt to the audience feedback. In the beginning, and we'll talk about some fears at the end, right? I was fearful of the audience. Eventually, I learned to understand that the audience is part of the power for a speaker, because I can look at the audience. I can look at them and I can get a feel for what's going on. Unlike the written text, speeches offer an opportunity for immediate interaction and adaptation. One of the things I dislike about teaching online is that I can't see the class. I can't see if somebody looks really bored. I can't see if they look lost. Those things are important for me to adapt my speed, maybe stop and go back and redo something. All of those are part of having an audience, and they really make a difference. What I originally feared for the audience, that they would be looking at me, and that actually turned out to be the most valuable thing I eventually learned about working with the audience, because it made me a much better presenter in terms of what was going on. So we're going to start by looking at some of the speech writing strategies and techniques with Twwist. This is a sort of high-level overview. We're going to hit the big things, and then we're going to dive down into a little bit more detail. So these are sort of my 6 key steps for speech writing. So the first, you have to, when you're writing a speech, these are defining purposes and understanding the audience, right? These are, why am I giving this speech? Identifying the main message and the audience. This is true for anything we do with tactical writing. We've got to figure out, what is our objective? What is the audience? How are we going to do this, right? So if I think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, it was aimed at civil rights advocacy. His goal was to get people to worry and think about how we make changes in the way civil rights in this country work. Throughout today's lecture, I'm going to have examples. If you've never heard these speeches, almost every one I'm going to talk about what I would consider a classic speech. If you're, just go Google it, you'll find them. There's plenty of things to do. There's even some potential extra credit for doing these, right? Another example, but very different, was John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, where he tailored it to inspire a nation. And Kennedy's address, just in case people think about it, Martin Luther King was actually a great speaker all on his own. The stories behind when he gave that speech is he had written actually a quite different speech, and the last minutes changed some of it, and some of it was based on the reactions he got from the crowd in terms of how he was able to read it. But as a preacher, he was very practiced at it. Kennedy was practiced, but not near as practiced, and he actually had a team of people work on that inaugural address, right? They had a very clear message. So this is really taking audience analysis, the Twwist things we've talked about, and crafting a narrative and trying to figure out how do we make that really resonate with that audience. Some of you would do with Twwist anyhow, so it's not really a difference from what we would normally do. Another part of good speech writing is dealing with using content and supporting data. So I've got to collect relevant stories and statistics to support the main message. So Steve Jobs' iPhone launch presentation, using data to showcase the innovation. And even though there were other smartphones and whatever, he did a good job of using data to say, here's why we need to introduce this new kind of product, and things go on, right? So researching credible sources and relevant anecdotes. Speeches are a place where anecdotes can really be very important. And making that into part of your credible story, and having the sources that you can back it up. You're not going to have references, so you have to be able to say quickly what those are and gain credibility through that reference. For example, before Reagan was extremely well known, he had a great speech called "A Time for Choosing," where he was dealing with Goldwater's nomination. And in that speech, he's got both passion and a bunch of other items in terms of storytelling, but he also gets to some economic data and some anecdotes that really make the data stick with the audience. That's the kind of thing. And again, this is really employing audience research, which we've talked about a lot with the Twwist approach, right, to enhance your storytelling technique. The only difference for speeches are you have to keep it very short, and you can't have long references in terms of what you're going to do. As you want to tailor the message to the audience, so based on that, right, this is where it gets a little bit slightly different, because you want to customize the content and style to resonate with the audience. You do that in any tactical writing technique, but you do have to make sure you get to a deeper understanding of the audience, and your audience analysis has a big advantage. You can actually adapt your language and the content to the audience interests while it's happening. And there's some techniques where you start off with your audience-centered analysis of Twwist, you analyze it, and then you literally try and view it as though you're speaking to different groups. You can adapt the same message in different ways, but this is a place where you can use timing and tone to modify the way it comes across. You can have something where you thought it was going to be funny or humorous, and the audience seems not to smile and laugh, then you can change the way you say it. Maybe it's the way you say it, so later on you can adapt your thing. So the tailoring the message and adapting is a little bit more nuanced for speeches. Editing and refinement is really important for speeches. You want to revise a speech for clarity, coherence, and impact. Most speeches are very short compared to like a proposal or whatever. So if you only got 2 or 3 minutes, you got to really make sure everything you're saying works in there. Winston Churchill's wartime speeches were refined for clarity and motivational impact. They would go through them again and again until he was happy with them. He had a team of people again. So many of the most famous speeches you will see were not just the person speaking. There was a team of people that worked with him. Getting the feedback from different people is very important. And some of these are techniques where you can take complex ideas and without losing the essential information, or maybe with losing the essential information, as long as your audience thinks they got the most important parts. I guess that's what essential would mean here. Elon Musk did a really good job when he was early in Tesla making complex technology accessible to the average audience. Why is it important? What's going to be different? What's going to work? Those kinds of things are things you want to practice, refine, and edit, right? And we'll talk about editing in another chapter, but for speeches, you're editing for what they're going to sound like. So the storytelling techniques in speech structuring, again, standard twist where we're doing storytelling into our speech structure. You want to have narrative elements that make them engaging and memorable. Masala Yousafzai's UN speech using her personal story for impact. Speeches are a place where you can really get to personal, emotional stories to create that narrative arc that really engages the audience. We've talked about how important storytelling is. Because you get to use your body, your face, your tone, you can draw out emotions in a way that are very hard for many people to get in writing. Because in writing, the tone is in the reader's head. Here it's your tone, your ability to stop and talk about the pains and issues you felt with. And that can make it really a powerful technique. So there is a lot of opportunity for collaborative feedback. As I said, working with co-writers or advisors to refine the speech. JFK's speech writing team collaborating on his iconic speeches. Team, 4 or 5 people working on this, and then very often you would practice it to other people and get feedback. So finding ways to incorporate diverse perspectives. TED speakers often use collaborative feedback to refine their talks. TED as an organization gives speakers feedback on how to improve what they're talking about, both in terms of story and presentation. And so basically this is enhancing you through collaborative storytelling and review. Again, classic parts of Twwist. So everything we've talked about this semester applies here. The one thing that's very different is really practice and delivery preparation. You've got to prepare for speech practice and familiarization with the content. Barack Obama's team was somewhat famous internally for rehearsal sessions for major addresses. Like you might get to listen to the same speech 12 times as he refines it. And after a little while, you have to bring in new people because, in fact, they've heard it so many times they're not reacting the same way. So you need some fresh blood, right? You got to find a way of doing it. Now, the nice thing about this is it can also help you master your confidence for speaking, right? Provide natural. So in Twwist, one of the first things we do is we use, of course, our SMART techniques. We want to analyze our objectives. So the objectives and goals for speeches are generally twofold, right? The first is a high-level goal for which there are generally 3 that we're going to talk about: to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. And then within each of those, you can have a sub-goal. So, for example, to inform, my goal might be to educate the audience with a clear structure and factual data. That's what I want to do for almost any information. I might have a lecture on climate change using graphs to show temperature changes. I could be trying to argue either side of that. Doesn't matter. Or I could be trying to inform, which often means I try and provide a balanced view where I have both, the issues and the things. Because if I'm only presenting one side, then I'm really trying to persuade. I'm trying to influence the behaviors or actions, often with an emotional appeal and strong evidence. So the emotional appeal is often an important part of persuasion, and often we're trying to informing in a way that is not very emotional, which can make the stories a little bit less engaging and a little bit less memorable. There is a way to work the emotional side into information where I tell stories about things that have an emotion where I try not to put my own in. But so, a campaign speech urging for policy changes supported by statistics would be an example of really trying to persuade. All marketing, which is and sometimes a kind of a speech, right? There's a narration order to go with it. So it has a lot of the auditory aspects of the presentation. they're also all trying to persuade. The last category, which I'm really not going to talk about because one, I'm not very good at it, and two, it's a little less where we're focused on, is entertainment. Right? There's lots of ways involving storytelling, stand-up, again, TV, media. There's a ton of things that are entertaining. All of them build on the same techniques. So as a bunch of the others, plus the issues of influence and some things about whatever the topic is. So to sort of look at how you can, so again, this is now looking at what's different, right? Verbal storytelling in speech is often very, very critical. And so you've got to have a strong opening, a logical development, and powerful closing. Movies and things that are long enough and have an added visual presentation on the screen can do more complicated things that jump back in time or whatever. And until you're very experienced, don't try this. A logical development, right, is going to be more powerful. You can still be using the story structure of a hero's journey or whatever, with a strong opening, development, and closing. All of those things make sense. But you've got to be careful to keep the story structure something super familiar to the audience so they can predict what's going to happen next, because that anticipation makes it easier for them to remember what's going on. Obviously, and we'll talk a little bit more about word choice, right? Using words to resonate with the audience, using rhetorical devices, which I'll define in just a little bit, anecdotes, humors, all of these things, like using metaphors and motivational speeches, right? One of the things that I find very important is to actually intentionally try and craft for memorability, where you want to craft memorable sound bites. And of course, you've all grown up in a world where sound bites you hear all the time. But one of the reasons that's effective is I can have 30 minutes of a speech on the floor of Congress can be reduced to a 30-second soundbite, which is, here is the one thing I wanted you to remember. Crafting those takes time, trying to figure out, and then having the rest of the story be connected back to them to reinforce it. So the memorability of the soundbite is further reinforced by the speech itself. So, but that takes a bit of effort. You might have that in a written document, but not to the same level. There's physical aspects to a speech, right? So nonverbal cues like body language and gesturing are vital for effective delivery, right? Some of the videos, I'm down here in the bottom corner moving my hands, and other times I'm not. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. Different people will respond differently. But in a real presentation, your body language is really important. Aligning gestures with a message can really enhance key points. Sometimes when I'm pointing at something, you can do that. Being able to move around, which is harder in front of the camera, add some energy, which is another part of what you get with it. Facial expressions, their ability to convey emotions, deepening the audience connection can really make that. And how I use the space. So again, when I walk around, I can engage different parts of the audience. If you're in a large enough auditorium where you can walk on stage because you have a wireless mic, when you walk to one side of the audience or the other, that side of the audience gets more engaged. They feel different things going on. So that's the effective use of space. And then related facial expressions, but different, is eye contact, how I look at it. So right now I'm looking straight at the camera. It should give you a stronger feeling that I'm engaging with you. When I look away, it's just not as engaging. As a human, that distinction is wired into us at a very early age. Before babies can speak, they understand when someone's looking at them and when they're not. And they make a fuss when they're not getting the attention they want sometimes. So finding a way to make that eye contact. And I'll come back to that when we talk about the fears and whatever, because it doesn't have to quite be eye contact. I am not looking at the camera. You may not be able to tell because I'm looking close enough, but it's not the actual camera. You can do the same thing with people's eyes. Visual storytelling in the presentations, again, we talked a little bit about this, but finding visual elements to enhance your message, coming with a way to make that happen. When you're doing a presentation, having infographics to illustrate points, not just bullet points like I have here, right? Having dynamic visuals like videos can really make a presentation much more interactive and engaging. They take a good bit of time. On some of my more important presentations, I will spend longer on the graphics than I do on the text. One, because the text is short and the images take a while to find, make sure I have the right licenses or to generate them. But I will spend a lot of time telling the story, and I spend more on that than either of the two pieces, because I got to think about what images will work. But I actually iterate on that. What's the images that I can find? What can I go do? Oh, that'll change a little bit what I'm going to say, and then you're going to iterate through that process. But thinking about your visual storytelling in presentation is actually important. So I already briefly mentioned on one of these, there's a difference between speeches and presentations. And to me, really, you want to recognize the goals, because if it's a presentation, it's an informational session is probably more of a presentation. Persuasion and entertainment are more of speeches. But there's a difference between the emphasis. So I can have a very formal speech versus an interactive business presentation. And that's going to change a little bit what I want to be able to do. I find the best way to have a good interactive business presentation is to still prep as though I was actually giving a formal presentation, even when I'm not going to have the slides, right? But you got to, if you're not going to have slides, you can still have a presentation without slides. You just have to design it differently. But it's not a speech because you want to stop and interact. I want to ask a question. I want to engage with them in a way that makes that happen. And so you will design and actually add questions in. Stop, ask this question, right? So you make sure you're doing that in your interactive business presentations. And then, of course, there's the purpose, right? Am I doing this for presentations? A graduation speech is very different than an educational workshop, both of which could be happening at the university, right? They're different goals. Those goals change everything about what you're trying to do. So you want to set those things up front, think about how you want them to work, and then you'll work that in. Finally, this is a thing I don't have that much experience with, although I've written business presentations for other people. I've actually never been a real speechwriter, but I've read about it, and writing for other people. When I wrote for the CEO of my first and second company, I would write the speeches or the presentations, and then they would be the one delivering. So it's a very distinct approach from writing for your personal things, because when I'm speaking, I'm tailoring stuff to my own style, my own authenticity, and so it's easy. I can work in personal analysis, motivational speech. When you're writing for others, you've got to understand their style and their preference for natural delivery. So when I'm ghostwriting a speech for a CEO, I can't talk like I talk, right? It's not the same way. They will. I might use different phrasing, more technical words. Got to write it in a style that matches them, and that's part of what speech writers become very good at. Is I want it to sound like an authentic version of that person, even though I'm writing the words for that person. Sometimes the person's not actually being authentic. They want to sound a particular way, but you got to figure out what that is in terms of your personal speeches. Now, I decided to make a jump back, way back. Classical speech writing, this is actually something I studied in college, right, is rooted in ancient rhetoric, basically back in the Greeks, and there's stuff even before the Greeks, but Aristotle's book called The Rhetoric, outlining the art of persuasion through ethos, pathos, and logos, which I'll get into in just a second, right? And there were a bunch of really great Roman speech writers, right? They had hundreds of years of Roman Empire rule, so it's not like just one or two in a certain period of time. Both the Greeks and the Romans had a lot of focus on oral presentation. Why? Well, a clear reason they needed this was that most of the world at that time, most of even the somewhat educated people, didn't read and write. Writing was very hard. If I had to take clay tablets and chisel in what I wanted to say, writing was hard. So they spent a lot more time figuring out, how do I give a good talk? How do I speak to a large audience? So when the Roman, Caesar would speak to a large audience, he could move public opinion in a way with speeches that he could not do with writing, because most of them couldn't read. So speeches developed as a critical ending, so they spent lots of time formalizing a bunch of this stuff. So in Aristotle's rhetoric, which is now sort of partially put together in this idea of what's called a rhetoric triangle, there are three core things. There's the ethos, the me, this credibility of the speaker. What am I saying? What is my credibility? How do I come across in that? There's the pathos, the motivation of emotions in the audience. So this is really aimed at the audience, but where I'm trying to stir their emotion, and because not everyone is emotional feeling types, as we've talked about with personalities, right? There's other people that are more logic, and so I need to have logos, the persuasive arguments based on logic and data to the case in question. So very much some of the ideas within Twwist are all influenced by this long history of what works with I have some credibility as a speaker, and I've got something about emotion and something about logic to appeal to different parts of the audience. There are, in fact, what are 5 canons, the basic core tenets of rhetoric. The first is inventio, or invention, where you develop your arguments based on effective communication, gather information, supporting evidence, and ideas, right? First stages. The second is the arrangement, which how we structure the order of things, right? The organization structure of your message determines how your content is presented logically. So think like the hero's journey versus an oratory argument where I'm going through time and history. Both of those can be effective for different audiences. You got to figure out which of those you want to do. You have your allocutio, your style, your choice of words, sentence structures, overall style. This influences how your message is delivered and how it's received. This is where you're going to put in word choices, but also timing and pauses and whatever. There's what they call memoria, which actually, in my view, has 2 parts. The first is practicing and memorizing, internalizing your message. You have to know what you're going to say to the point where you can talk and you're not reading, but when you give the talk, you don't skip stuff, you don't forget stuff. This is actually very important, and we've already talked a little bit about some of the ideas like a memory palace where you're imagining visual things to help you remember as you go through your story so you don't mess stuff up. Memory can also be very important to enable your confidence in effective delivery. You can actually memorize stuff to the point where now I can focus on energy and presentation, looking at the audience. And the other dimension of this, which I think actually fits within some of the writing, but is not always captured when people talk about the candidates or whatever, is you are also in going back to the way you're making your arguments and having visual stuff is the use of memory devices for your audience so they can put that together. And the last thing, pronunciato, however you pronounce that, is your delivery, the art of effective vocal and physical presentation. You should be able to use, properly pronounce the words that you have in your thing. But this includes tone, pacing, gestures, body language, right? These candidates form the foundation for all effective communication and persuasive storytelling. So I'm putting these here at the end of the course in part because I want you to know these terms because if you interact with other people, they may use these terms and so you should understand what's going on. So having a little bit of that classic relationship can help you better communicate with audiences in terms of what's going on. So there's actually a strong relationship between the rhetorical triangle and the tactical storytelling tetrahedron. So I'm going to briefly cover that. So when we look at some of those things, right, we're going to want to have a combination. When I'm telling a good story, I want the ethos, pathos, and logos to come together. And Martin Luther King was really good at balancing all of these together. And we want to adapt our technique. So when I think about our rhetorical triangle, we have the ethos, the pathos, and the logos, right? And the storytelling triangle is the audience, the storyteller, and the story. And so the audience and story are not quite the same as pathos and logos, but they're similar in the sense that I can think of this as the story, the content is the logical arguments, and the pathos and the audience is the emotional. I actually prefer thinking of it not in terms of the two pieces, but there is an audience, and within that audience, I can actually have pathos and logos and put them together. Our storytelling tetrahedron is where we have our tactical objective, and this is where it actually allows me to tie better to the rhetorical triangle than just the classic storytelling triangle, because whether I'm going to use pathos or logos is part of how I've analyzed my audience and what is my tactical objective. The story you want to tell, the truths in the science, or the story I'm trying to convey, right, that is actually probably not going to change. How I tell it will change. So my tactical objective is what influences how I balance pathos and logos, and even a little bit how I build up some of my credibility through that audience. So understanding that those three dimensions of credibility, emotion, and logic are important, I then use my tactical objective and my knowledge of the audience and the storyteller to change how I'm going to do. So when I go through all of that, right, I can actually look back at Kendall Haven's insights in terms of story proof and story smart, right? And really, the canons of rhetorics are effective storytelling techniques in terms of all of them. I'm going to very quickly just hit on a couple of these, right? Just so you can sort of see that this is, again, reinforcing the power of storytelling and the science of storytelling, because this is all about the cognitive processes. One of the reasons is, Haven says we evolved to tell stories. I believe that stories have evolved to match what we can do. The Greeks and Romans were doing this for a long time and figuring out what worked and didn't. They were perfecting the art of storytelling with these items long before most people could read and write. So, if you think about inventio, the sort of in that part, right, I want to have cognitive engagement. I'm going to align the audience's worldviews and connect with those values. Right? So as I'm doing that, I'm following Kendall Haven's approaches of find that context that connects with values and beliefs. My disputo, my narrative and coherence, right? I'm looking at logical structures and emotional things and probably building that structure on something the audience will know so it becomes more memorable. My linguistic effectiveness, the impact of word choice languages. This is one place where I think it doesn't quite match into Haven's work. He didn't get into individual word choices, in part because it's probably a little more difficult, but it's clear that all the individual word choices and language patterns have a strong emotional impact, and so in that dimension it still ties through. Memoria and story-enhanced memories, right? We have a deeper understanding of how memoria is effective for storytelling and our ability to make them. And then the last one, pronunciato, engaging delivery, vocal model, all of these are part of the storytelling part, which we didn't really cover as much, but Hayden does, Dr. Haven does cover in his work that the emotional expression, all of those things are important for making important storytelling memorable, and that's speeches are just a subset of, or a superset of storytelling. So now we're going to look through a bunch of the formal devices, what are called rhetorical devices. You'll see most of them have like funky names. The names are not near as important, although it's good for you to know the names because somebody might use them. But more important is to use the ideas and be able to use those, right? So when we're trying to create memorable, impactful speeches, we want to start with things that can be there. So a soundbite, something very simple and easy to remember, but something that everyone can relate to, can have a lasting impression. So the I have a dream speech of Martin Luther King, right, is a great speech, but just that phrase, I have a dream, that captures the essence of what that entire speech is about, gets reiterated a dozen or so times in there, and because of the way it's told, you get to see it as a dream, but also as a future dream, not just one he's having now. So that becomes a very good soundbite. You want to find ways to have rhythm and emphasis that can add clarity and memorability to complex ideas. So President Obama's speeches often had an iambic rhythm. Iambic is this sort of iambic pentameter, if you remember your Shakespeare, right? Da 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 da. That kind of pattern can get the audience to sort of move along with you and can add emphasis when you get to the final, especially the final part of the ta of your process. So, but then there's other simple things to work in. Again, these are things that are difficult to do in large documents, but much more easy to do in parts of a speech where you can have alliteration, the repetition of initial sounding consonants and vowels. So, let us go forth to lead the land we love. We get the L's going there, right? That makes that phrase a little bit more memorable. So if I'm trying to have a soundbite, one that's sticky and memorable will be better. And the apostys is the repetition of last words, the beginning of that. So strength through unity, unity through faith. So this is something, again, by using the last word, you get to reiterate something, and the focus here in that phrase is clearly about unity. And so that allows us to build on top of things. Antimetoba, repeating arrays in reverse order. We'll actually see this particular quote because it's got two different aspects. Again, ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country, right? So it's sort of reversing the order. That plays a little mind game that makes it a little easier for people to remember because the first part of it is put together. And it's related to the idea of antithesis, where we have a juxtaposition of contrasting ideas. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? That makes and it keeps going on. It was the best. That phrasing makes it memorable, and the repeat of the beginning phrase also makes it memorable. Metaphors, which we've already talked about in previous lectures, right? Comparing for descriptive purposes, right? In a sort of play, right? All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players, right? This is a metaphor. We're saying what's happening for a metaphor for the rule. Finding a good metaphor is critically important in lots of storytelling, but for a speech, it can be the difference between you being able to tell an emotional story that connects to whatever your purpose is, because your purpose may not have that same thing, but the metaphor lets people get it. And obviously related to metaphors, we'll have analogies, which we've already covered, and similes where we use like or brave. He's as brave as a lion, he faces his enemy. Right? Storytelling uses these kinds of things because you can make the like or the as very dramatic in terms of almost hyperbole. Ascendin, the omission of conjunctions for impact. This is one you have to be a little careful if you use any automated tools because they'll want to fix things, right? So Abraham Lincoln's speech of government of the people, by the people, for the people could actually have a bunch of conjunctives in there, right? Government of the people, by the people, and for the people would be how you would normally phrase it, but skip the and it actually has a little bit more contrasting, right? And so that can make it a little bit more engaging. Paralipsis, drawing attention by claiming not to mention something. This is true again in any writing, but very often important in speech making because you're basically having this rhetorical device to say, I'm not going to say something what it is. So I'm not going to mention the secret passage in the old mansion. I've told you there's one, but I'm not going to mention this. And it actually adds an increased emphasis than if I just said there's a secret passage in the mansion. By saying I'm not going to mention it, I increase the emphasis on it while I'm trying to say I'm not emphasizing it, which provides, again, a nice technique. So we can use all the classic things, Aristotelian logic, rhetoric, right? Ethos, pathos, and logos as persuasive strategies. And if I can put them together, 2 or 3 of those together, right? So we do not want war. The mothers of America who sent their sons to war do not want war, right? We're simultaneously adding a little bit of logic and a lot of emotion into this statement. And as this was said by then President Ronald Reagan, right? He instantly starts as president with a bunch of ethos in terms of what's going on. Another related Aristotelian technique is the idea of rhetorical questions, where the question is posed for effect. You don't actually ask anyone to answer it. So when he's giving his speech, right, about how long will we have to deal with the issues that civil rights were trying to come across, right? You can stop in the middle of essays like, so how long? Not long, because no lie can live forever, right? This is about like people not being equal, right? You almost always when you have a rhetorical question, it's important to have that pause, because that's part of how you tell the audience. But that pause is so they can think about how they feel, what the logic, whatever the answer is, right? Rhetorical questions are a very effective way of getting the audience to think. The more they think, the more they will be engaged. We can drive along in our speeches with hyperbole, right? So exaggerated statements. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, right? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There's many things we have to fear, but he's saying there's only one thing, right? That hyperbole makes this statement more memorable. There's a bunch of also alliterations and other things in there. There can be irony, significant, added for emphasis where something's opposite. So democracy is a precious thing, especially to a dictator, right? The appearance of democracy kind of thing. Parallelism, where we have similar structures in a series of related words or phrases. To err is human, to forgive divine. So we have this to and whatever. That kind of structure, again, can make short phrases. A lot of these things I just went through are good examples of what you want to do when you're trying to think of how do I craft that soundbite. I want the soundbite to have a bunch of these things put together. So chiasmus is a reversal of the word orders in parallel phrases. So we actually already saw this, right? This one's got 2 things. Ask not what you can do. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country, right? So this is a parallel structure, which I hadn't mentioned before, right? But it's a parallel structure, but now I'm sort of reversing it. And again, that cognitive dissonance that gets created makes it a little bit more memorable. And a 4 is the repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of successive clauses as a way to do things. We shall not flag or fail. We should go on to the end. In fact, that I think there's 5 or 6 more we shalls in that Winston Churchill speech. By we shall, like we're going to keep going on no matter what happens. That really made the phrases stand out, and that's the kind of thing that you don't accidentally happen upon, right? You could have the exact same statements of logic, but you've got to go beyond logic for a really good speech. You want to go back in and make all of those things happen. So this is a place where you take a message, you go back and say, okay, here's my soundbite, I'm going to work on it. Here's the intro. Very often speeches, some of the most memorable parts of lots of speeches are the intro, because if I don't engage the audience, then I've lost them forever. So I got to engage them in the beginning, and that first bit is a great chance to catch them, because they're all probably listening for the first minute, and then after that we'll see what happens. So now I'm going to switch over to some actual practical things. So the preparation and practice for speeches. One of the things you want to do is you want to practice. It doesn't matter how good you are. I've been doing this now for 40 years, right? I still practice talks. Maybe it's because I'm more nervous, but the best way, in my view, by far, is to record your performance and then analyze the performance through recording. It is very hard to think about what you're doing and do it at the same time. So by having a camera record you, you can practice it, then you can watch it, you can critique it, you can do self-critique, you can get other people to critique it. And to go through this and identify your areas for improvement. I spent lots of time when I was first starting, back when cameras were these giant things you carried on your shoulder. It was a lot harder, but it was an investment so that I could get better at presenting. And you want to find an iterative improvement. So when I work on really important speeches, when I was pitching, for example, funding for my company, I would refine that. I would practice it in front of a camera. I'd go back and I'd refine it and work my way through it. So that's a very important part of your technique. We'll come back to that. Another thing that I think is really useful, and I have used all the time and I try and get my students to use, is the idea of auto-time presentations and then I'll come back to the audience reading. So auto time presentations are when I give the presentation, unlike this one, the slides will advance automatically. Everything happens. So I will give a 5-minute talk, and every slide advance, every animation on a slide, all of that is absolutely timed. And I find this super important. The shorter the talk, the more important it is to do this. But this does two things. One, it actually reduces my concerns because I can't run out of time. The slides are moving. If they keep moving, I've got to keep up. I may adjust little bits of, throughout the talk, but I don't get to the end of a 20-minute talk, like a job talk, and find out I've got 10 slides and 1 minute left, right? That just looks bad. So by using auto timing, all of that keeps me so that any errors I make can't compound and get worse. And it also allows me to practice in a precise way. Every practice, the timing is happening automatically, and then I can go in and adjust it. In PowerPoint, there's actually techniques where you can go and you can adjust how long each animation is, how long every slide lasts, and I will use that to say, okay, it's got to be exactly 5 minutes. I will go through it, and once I've figured out here's the order, the timing of every slide, then I practice the speech to make it fit the slides, because it's easier for me to adjust the words. The last part, which is the opposite, but can still be related, is reading the audience, right? You've got to adapt to the audience reaction. You want to pay attention to the audience reaction and adjust your delivery. This takes even more experience and practice. And if you have auto-time presentations, one of the things people will often tell me is that, oh no, auto-timing means you can't read the audience more. It's like, no, you can still read the audience. You just have to read the audience and keep on time. I've actually used this as a technique for a number of the really big conferences I run, where we used to have people running over or ending too fast. And we moved to a thing where authors submit a 5-minute video or a 4-minute, 55-second video, and everything is auto time. In the beginning, a bunch of faculty were like, oh, this would be bad. They can't read the audience. They won't get. It turns out that they got better at reading the audience because they weren't worrying about advancing the slides and all this other stuff. Everything was automatically happening. If they practice, you can look at the audience and talk because you know everything and you don't have to do anything else. All you have to do is speak. So that actually can make it better. So the last thing I'm going to hit on here is overcoming the fear of public speaking. And when you go to give a talk, especially if you're nervous in the beginning, it feels like there's all these eyes are looking at you. There's somebody's monster's going to jump out. There's bats. So people struggle with this. And my own personal story, which I'll get to, right, is about addressing some of these fears, right? But glossophobia, the fear of public speaking, affects up to 75% of the population. So chances are really good. A lot of you have this fear. In fact, it not only does it affect them, it is often ranked higher than the fear of death among people. They are more afraid to speak publicly than of dying. They would rather give the eulogy, they'd rather be in the casket rather than give the eulogy. Overcoming this fear is crucial for effective personal communication in your professional and personal lives, right? You've got to get over some of this. Do you have to be happy about doing it? No, but you've got to work through this. I knew I wanted to be a professor since I was in 6th grade when I fell in love with teaching other students. But I was good one-on-one, but I couldn't handle a crowd. So first thing you have to do is you have to understand and address your fear. You've got to recognize the specific fears related to public speaking. Some of them were understanding what was going to happen, right? So first is imagining successful public speaking experiences. Reframing it from a mindset of the view of public speaking as an opportunity. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to talk in front of people. I was just scared, right? And understanding that it was a fear, but analyzing it from what can go wrong, right? The worst that will happen is I will give a talk, and actually the worst that happens is people don't care. If I get people angry, that's a different problem, right? If they think I'm an idiot, right? I did worry about that because lack of self-confidence. I quickly realized that being afraid of public speaking is something that most of the audience also feared, and therefore they weren't going to be too angry about a few opportunities. Because of my dyslexia, I suffer from this a lot more. I can't read very easily, especially reading and talking at the same time. It's just not something I can do. So I had to do this. But viewing it as a learning opportunity, I found places where I could go practice. I'll get to that in just a little bit. And view this as a chance while you're in college to go practice this. Because once you get to be in a company, if you're going to pitch to a client or pitch to your boss, you can't be making those mistakes then. You want to practice and get them through now. The first thing that really helped me, and is where I think you should start, is preparation and familiarization. Because I knew I wanted to do this, one of the first things I did is I got involved in 9th grade in the debate team. because I could know my topic, I could study those things so well, it was much easier because I wasn't thinking about talking and trying to think about data or facts or whatever. Right? I knew everything. Right? There was, my topics, I was so well studied, I could talk about anything. And that just made more of a conversation instead of a speech. Speeches were petrifying. Debating was easy because it was an argument, which I could get involved with people. You want to get comfortable with the environment. I would always go in and make sure I understood what was where. I've had talks where I practiced the night before and the day of, like the environment. Between night and day, things can be different. So practice, make sure you have backups, all those kinds of things. Practice repeatedly, make your speech. That's something you should always be thinking about doing. But you really want to practice like you will perform. You want to mimic actual performance conditions during practice. As I said, I had one practice where I practiced at night. It was in a room. Everything was dark. I had slides. The presentation went great. The next day, I found out, or I should have realized it, but I hadn't paid enough attention. The room was actually a glass room with curtains around the outside edge. And the slide projector wasn't bright enough to actually see most of my slides. And so my entire presentation, again, this is one of my petrifying moments, my entire slides were like useless. And I luckily had thought through this. I had been prepared. I had a set of transparencies, these old things you put on an overhead projector, which is the way many people give their talks. I swapped over, did this because I had practiced both ways. I was able to make it through that situation, even though I hadn't actually practiced the way I should have, but I could have done it. Another technique, which still is very useful, and I will do it on higher impact things, is deep breathing. Literally just before and during the speech, 5 or 6 big deep breaths will slow your heart rate, make you relax, and that can help. There are techniques for progressive muscle relaxation where you actually tense up and then progressively relax them. And then mindful meditation. This is not one I personally do, but many people, a couple of my students have actually tried to get me to do it because they say I could calm down a little bit and do some mindful meditation. But if you're really bad, but it's necessary for your job, or if you just want to get better, seek professional help. Now, I'm not talking about a psychiatrist, right? Although that can be the second category, therapeutic support. One of my students had anxiety attacks so badly that he couldn't get in front of a crowd. He would just stop breathing properly and just freak out. Getting some help from a professional therapist made them a lot better. But there's much easier is getting public speaking coaches, personalized guidance, and feedback. So you want to get constructive feedback regularly, figuring out how to work your way up to that, and getting feedback and iterating, right? Building confidence through small steps. And this is actually one of the ones that's easiest for you to do. It's best if you do this and get a coach who can give you some practice. So start with smaller groups. As I said, I started as a debater. In a debate, we basically had either me and one other person or a team of 2 and 2 of them and a judge, right? There were like 4 people in the room. The size of the crowd made it a lot easier for me to focus on what I was doing and not on the crowd. Eventually, I took a class in college on public speaking. It made me get out there. They actually made us do some things. Join a public speaking group to practice. And they can generally be, as a group, they'll be supportive. I don't know if campus actually has a public speaking club, but if it's not, join one. But there's plenty of opportunities for workshops and courses here and there to go better, to get better at stuff. I like to think of karaoke and open mic as two big steps. Karaoke, for many people, you're basically singing a song you know. You can practice your dynamic speaking. You can practice audience engagement techniques, but you're not worrying about the content. And to be honest, most of the time when you're doing this, you're in a very friendly environment. I do recommend if you do any karaoke, you do it completely sober. Everyone else may be drunk, but you should be doing sober. Otherwise, you're not going to get the practice effect you want. You don't want to practice drunk or even slightly inebriated, because that's not the way you're going to give your talk. So you got to get through that. Open mic nights are far more terrifying in the beginning, and then you find out that those people are super helpful as well. So most open mic nights, you can go read poetry. Depends on poetry, the ones I've been to, so that's all I can really talk to. But you have memorized a poem. You know what you're talking about. You get to engage with the audience, but now it's not quite the same as lyrical singing. But to me, that was a good thing for me to do in college and work my way up to that. You want to record and review. Again, we already talked a little bit about that. And finding ways to get constructive criticism. This idea of gradual exposure, coming back to starting with smaller groups and then working your way up. I actually started this when I was in high school. I actually took part in the theater groups, but I couldn't get a speaking role. I was way too petrified to speak, and because of my reading issues, I couldn't read when they were doing tryouts. I was terrible at it anyhow. So I did non-speaking roles. I was Toto in The Wizard of Oz and Igor in Frankenstein. I was on stage the entire time for most of those because Toto's always on the stage whenever Dorothy's there, but I never had to say anything. But I got to stand in front of the crowd and look and watch. And one of the things I got out of this is I got to watch all of the mistakes that all of the other players were making that I knew because I knew the script, I knew what was going on. And I recognized the audience doesn't know the script. They don't know what's going wrong. So most of the time, they were completely oblivious. My fear of misstating something because I wasn't doing something the audience knew exactly what should have been said, wasn't matter. As long as the plot line was going, it was fine. Shakespeare would have been trickier because you have to get the words right in Shakespeare, but that gradual exposure, increasing the audience size, and learning to recognize that all kinds of other people make mistakes and no one cares, that will help you through your fears. Taking a public-facing role, so practicing speaking to strangers. I actually worked in a deli, and then when I went to, I tried door-to-door salespeople. All of those public-facing roles was a way for me to practice speaking to people as well as making money to pay for college. And then one of the things I did in college was part of what I did in my public speaking classes. We had a speaking journal. We had to document our experiences and reflect on improvement and how we could do better. Part of that class actually made us do more public-facing speaking. We took those big 1970s giant cameras. We went and interviewed people on the streets of New York, and then we had to go back and document our process and what was going on. And we always did these in pairs. And so we had to analyze both ours and our partners' processes, and then we would trade journals. And it was a great way of understanding and reinforcing this, that most of the people we talked to were oblivious to any error that we made as a speaker. And once you realize that, speaking becomes less threatening because it doesn't really matter. The only thing that speakers would notice was if you stopped or stammered. And so you just got to practice that. But the content of what you're saying is generally not something they're aware of, so you can get through it. So the last thing for this is when you're going to do public speaking is get beyond reading. You want to have memorization and a few talking points. And a number of my students have gone through this process when they first started trying to pitch their business. They wrote down every word of a script. That's not bad. Read through it, practice it. But do not practice it with the words in front of you after the first couple of times. You want to have key talking points. So in your PowerPoint, if you actually do it, right, you can have notes on the side. You can have a one note card with a couple of lines on it so you don't forget things. But don't try and read. You want to have memorized this. You can have some visual aids where it uses as prompt for talking points. Good talks, unlike this one here, often will have a bunch of images and not a whole lot of words. Those images can remind you what you want to say. But that's all you need is a prompt. You don't need all these words to go on, right? The more it's what you're looking at the audience, the more it's based on visuals, the easier it is for them to retain. And then the next one is practicing to video for both memory and timing. As I said, you want to record stuff. If you do auto time stuff and you record stuff, one of the things that has helped the students for the conferences, because we asked and got feedback on it, and this explicitly, was that they found that having recorded their talk and then listening to it 20 or 30 times made it to the point where they knew everything. And it was so easy. You just put it on your phone, you listen to it, It's a 5-minute talk. You can listen to it 20 times in an hour. And now you've really got the timing, not just the words, but the timing of what you're going to say. And that regular process makes it easier. For many of them, they literally listen to it once or twice again that morning. That regularly reinforces the memory and your confidence in the materials, and that can make it a lot easier for you to address public speaking. So that's our talk on using Twwist techniques for speech writing. Again, most of speech writing is just like writing anything else with Twwist. You just got to worry a little bit more about what to say in terms of the lyrics, coming up with a good, nice, short soundbite, and then how to actually deliver it, which is one of the things to practice.